Hi, I'm Phil Howard, Director of the Center for Media and Communication Studies in the School for Public Policy at CEU. Welcome to the Media and Change series. For the next few episodes, we'll be interviewing some of the most prominent international pundits, media scholars, journalists, experts in media and politics from around the world. In today's episode, we have with us Professor Selcan Kaynak of Bogazici University, one of the world's experts on Turkish media politics and a scholar from Istanbul. Welcome, Selcan.
Such a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming in. So, you've got an exciting few months ahead of you in Turkey. There's a major election, right?
Yes, we have upcoming local elections at the end of March. It's an exciting time for Turkish politics.
And Turkish politics has been in the news because of the internet law.
Yes.
Right? So how might the new internet law affect the political outcomes for the Istanbul mayoral race?
There's a background to the internet law. There has been a growing unrest with the current government in power. This past summer's events, especially starting in Istanbul, instigated major protests in wider Turkey. Started with the demolition of a public park, but it brought together various groups that had frustration with the current regime. And now from Istanbul, there were mobilization in various other cities as well. So given this background, the government, the Prime Minister in particular, is aware of wider opposition. So that is one background for the tightening control over the internet. The other background story is that there's been a power clash between the party in power, Erdogan particularly, and an Islamist network that were supporting them. And the power clash led to leaking of various phone conversations and corruption scandals that are mostly distributed through the internet and social networks. So one of the reasons that a lot of people think that there's a restriction on the internet now is to get rid of the distribution of such leaks, phone conversations, documents, etc.
So the new internet laws, it sounds like they're a defensive strategy.
Exactly.
President Erdogan, Prime Minister Erdogan, defending himself against former allies who are leaking information about what he and his cabinet is up to.
That is very true, yes.
Okay. Interesting. So one of the lessons I think from the Arab Spring is that digital media was useful in getting a lot of people out into the central square in Tahrir and in Tunis, Cairo and Tunis, to protest. But then those interesting social media protest networks didn't become political parties in their elections. Gezi had the same kind of dynamics. I think last year, unusually young, not Islamists, not Marxists, not particularly ideological, but they used social media very effectively and they dominated international news. Has Gezi had an impact in party politics in some way, or not really?
That's such a good question. You're right on target. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened in Istanbul with Gezi and now wider Turkey. Especially with the younger population that has been mobilized to this extent for the first time in Turkish politics that we've been experiencing. And especially there was a lot of sort of talk or discussion about the youth being disengaged from politics. There was no expectation of such an outburst of social opposition and political opposition on the streets. So, and one of the reasons that this did happen and a lot of people could mobilize and express their dissent was through the social networks. So on the one hand, yes, there is this wider mobilization and a lot of optimism, but on the other hand, even during summer and even more so now, there is the questioning about whether or not this will translate into mainstream politics and party politics. There have been forums and wider discussions that this social movement sustained over the summer and up until now. So it's not just through the social networks, there's still physical face-to-face interaction of mobilization, but that does not necessarily translate in some way into the elections or wider party politics. These movements are not organized in the traditional sense. As you said, there's no ideological or clear ideological backing of the existing political actors from this movement. And this in some way is liberating because they can form a coalition on a wider range of issues and express their frustration with traditional politics. But at the same time, to change the mainstream political institutions and processes, there have to be stable, long-term and sustained actors. And that we probably do not have necessarily at this point in Turkish politics, but it's open to open for future speculation. We don't know how it's going to happen in elections.
I think one of the interesting things for me about Turkish politics is that it looked like it took several years for political elites to take to social media, right? It was mostly the younger cohorts, the people who were tired of reading the state news. So they were getting their news over Twitter and other sources.
Right.
But then last fall, it seemed like the AKP suddenly got very good, right? And some of the ministers, Erdogan's ministers, have fabulous numbers of Twitter followers and were actually able to keep up the party spin online. So, I guess my question is, has the government caught up? Are they now actually pretty good at social media?
What would be our criterion for pretty good is something that's vague for me. But you're right. I mean, they caught up. They have various people who are working professionally for them who are mobilized on the social media. Various ministers are using actively. They're engaged in political discussions or polemics, rather, through Twitter, for example. There have been various instances of such debates going on. And they occupy the larger news media's agenda as well. So Twitter discussions then covered on television news, for example, or newspaper headlines, etc. And the mayor of Ankara, for example, he is quite known for using Twitter for his own purposes. Sometimes, about issues that do not even make sense or are not substantial at all. But he is able to hold a discussion there and have a lot of followers. So you're right. They did catch up, and they are pretty active, and they do have their own networks that ordinary citizens also are engaged in.
And I guess one of the criticisms or fears of using social media is that you'll develop pockets or sub-networks of people who just don't get news from elsewhere. And it sounds like the government has been pretty good at keeping these independent media ecologies from picking up news internationally or from other parts of the country.
Absolutely, this is very correct. And then we also have to keep in mind that a good portion of Turkish population is not so active online. The traditional news media is still the most popular form of news source for news. A lot of rural populations outside the major cities are not active in social networks, so their contact with politics or political actors are either through television or really face-to-face campaigning of politicians.
Social
and they're exactly. So they're quite active. And then the third component of the government's power in the digital media sphere, so to say, is through intimidation, through the internet law. And also after Gezi, for example, through summer, various people have been threatened with lawsuits about the content they posted online. People have lost jobs. So there is a culture of intimidation, direct or indirect, challenging of individuals for using social networks for criticizing the government. So that's also there.
And wasn't there an incident, maybe it was 2 years ago, where a batch of journalists were convicted for things they had said on Twitter, lost jobs, and there was a significant amount of social media sort of evidence used in court to prosecute journalists.
Yes.
Some of whom are still in jail.
Right. So social media is used for firing of journalists or even in court cases as evidence to their political positions.
So to what degree did the networks that formed around Gezi stay coherent? So one of the other things we've seen about the Arab Spring is that the networks of students that formed the first time in Tahrir Square actually came back a year later. Right? When Morsi wasn't doing well, they'd given the government the year to try to make some big changes. The networks were back a year later, and they got rid of another political leader in Egypt. Is there a chance that the Gezi networks will come back? May not be political parties, hierarchical political parties, like you say, but they may still be there. Right?
You're right. In some ways, in the digital media or social networks, they still, especially since the summer, Twitter users tripled. People experienced that mainstream news media were not reporting what was happening even in terms of traffic reports, which streets were blocked by the police, what was happening on the ground, etc., a lot of even ordinary citizens had to rely on social networks for getting their information as a news source. So that remained, actually. So a lot of people use Twitter and Facebook to get information about whatever is happening locally or in terms of larger national politics. So those networks have sustained, I think, in terms of everyday use and access to information. There are another major way through face-to-face interaction these networks stayed is through neighborhood forums. So Gezi was an experiment in the park itself, but also in various neighborhoods. People formed these forums to deliberate political issues, basically, and what they wanted for their neighborhoods. Summer was, of course, a time that a lot of young people, even other working people had long days. They had time. They could gather in the forums. For a couple of months in the evenings, people got together in their neighborhood parks. So in that sense, it was a very exciting experience. And to some extent, some of these forums still are active. People meet regularly, maybe once a week, and discuss national political issues, global issues, or neighborhood politics. And probably this has effects on the upcoming local elections in ways that we might not be able to assess empirically. There is mobilization on the ground in some ways. People are more engaged in politics and questioning what's happening and in contact with other people in their neighborhood or in other ways through digital media. And then a third option or possibility is, depending on the results of the elections and the ongoing political clash between the Gülen network and AKP and the crisis, the way it's resolved, there might be new ways of mobilization this summer, say, that people might take up to the streets again. And actually, on campuses, regarding younger people, and then also in neighborhoods, there has been various demonstrations. People have marched, for example, regarding the internet law. They have marched after the corruption scandals. So there's still some street activity in major cities, especially. It might turn into a wider scale protest again at some point. But the timing of such things, we never know ahead of time.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Would you say that on average, the level of information sophistication for Turkish voters is increasing a little bit, or is the fact that the government's managed to keep everybody apart, is that having an effect on people's ability to evaluate credible information online?
Right. Yusuf, I think, in terms of using social networks, having access to multiple sources of information, there is some sophistication, and wider publics now are interested in online sources of information. They know that certain documents, information about the government's dealings, for example, can be accessed online. So more citizens now know how to access such information, or say there's a restriction on the internet. They have to learn about the proxies or different ways of getting access to information. So there is some sophistication in utilizing various means. But at the same time, I think the government has been on top of keeping various publics separate. So in terms of credibility with their own voters, they have kept them in terms of
different networks.
In different networks.
Well, thank you for your time. Let's see if this long-term strategy actually works for Erdogan. Again, this is Professor Selcan Kaynak. Thank you for visiting. This is the first in a series on media and change. Please follow us over Twitter. The handle for our center is CMCS @CEU. I'm Phil Howard. Thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.